A young man wearing his late father's watch is approached on the street by a policeman who is shocked to recognize the watch. On a cool fall night, the streets of São Paulo pulsed with the energy typical of a metropolis that never sleeps. The sky, painted in shades of dark blue and purple, was dotted with thousands of lights shining from the windows of the skyscrapers. It was in this busy, urban setting that André, a young man of 28, walked hurriedly, his footsteps echoing on the concrete of the sidewalk. André was a man of medium height, with brown hair tousled by the wind and green eyes that seemed to carry the weight of an untold story. He wore a light blue dress shirt, slightly wrinkled after a long day at work, and faded jeans. His face, despite its youth, already showed expression lines that hinted at a life that was not always easy. As he walked, André unconsciously adjusted the watch on his left wrist. It was a habit he had had since he could remember. The watch, an antique piece with a brown leather strap and a gold dial, was more than just an accessory. For André, it represented the only tangible connection to his past, an inheritance from his adoptive father, or so he believed. The young man turned a corner, entering a less busy street. The shadows seemed deeper there, and the silence was broken only by the occasional bark of a distant dog or the rumble of a passing engine. André was so engrossed in his thoughts that he barely noticed the slowly approaching police car. "Good evening, citizen," a deep authoritative voice cut through the air, bringing André to an abrupt halt. "Could you accompany me to the vehicle for a routine check?" André turned, finding himself face to face with a tall, broad-shouldered policeman. The badge on his uniform identified him as Lieutenant Rodrigo. The policeman's face was serious, but his brown eyes conveyed a certain kindness that reassured André. "Of course, sir," André replied, trying to remain calm. He had nothing to hide, but encounters with the police always made him nervous. Lieutenant Rodrigo led André to the vehicle, where he began to ask the usual questions: name, address, reason for being on the street at that time. André answered mechanically, his mind wandering to the small, cozy apartment that awaited him a few blocks away. Then something unexpected happened. Lieutenant Rodrigo's gaze fell on the watch on André's wrist, and suddenly the policeman was paralyzed. His face paled as if he had seen a ghost. "That watch," Lieutenant Rodrigo muttered, his voice trembling. "Where did you get it?" André, confused by the sudden change in the policeman's demeanor, looked at the watch and then back at Rodrigo. "It was a present from my father," he replied hesitantly. "I mean my adoptive father. Why is that? Is something wrong?" Lieutenant Rodrigo seemed to struggle to find the words. His eyes, once calm, were now wide and filled with an emotion that André couldn't decipher. Was it fear, surprise, or something else? "Or, that watch," Rodrigo finally managed to say, "belonged to my twin brother, Carlos. He disappeared almost 3 decades ago." The policeman's words struck André like a thunderbolt. Suddenly, the world around him seemed to spin. The clock, his connection to the past, now became the epicenter of a mystery he had never imagined existed. "Your brother?" André asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "But how is that possible?" Lieutenant Rodrigo took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. "It's a long story," he said, running his hand over his tired face. "A story I thought I'd never have to tell again. But it seems that fate has other plans." Just then a cold breeze blew down the street, making the leaves of the nearby trees whisper as if they were sharing a long-kept secret. André felt a shiver run down his spine, not just from the cold, but from the feeling that his life was about to change drastically. "Perhaps," Rodrigo continued, his gaze fixed on the clock, "we should talk somewhere more appropriate. There's a cafe nearby that's open all night. What do you say we have a coffee and, well, try to unravel this mystery?" André nodded silently. What else could he do? In a matter of minutes, everything he thought he knew about his origins had been called into question. The questions that had always plagued him, who his biological parents were, why they abandoned him, suddenly seemed on the verge of being answered. The cafe Rodrigo took him to was a small, cozy establishment with yellowish lights that created an almost nostalgic atmosphere. The exposed brick walls were decorated with black and white photographs of São Paulo in times gone by. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the smell of old books from a small bookcase in the corner. They sat down at a secluded table, away from the few evening customers who occupied the place. A middle-aged waitress with a kind smile and tired eyes took their order. 2 strong, black coffees. "So," Andre began as soon as the waitress had left, "you said this watch belonged to your brother?" Rodrigo nodded, his eyes fixed on the gold piece on Andre's wrist. "Yes, it belonged to my twin brother, Carlos. We were inseparable as children, you know. But life has a way of tearing apart even the strongest bonds." Andre could feel the pain in the policeman's voice. It was an old pain, but still alive, like a wound that had never completely healed. "What happened to him?" Andre asked softly. Rodrigo sighed deeply before answering. "Carlos was always the more sensitive of the two of us. While I was the tough one, he was the dreamer. Maybe that's what made him more vulnerable. It started with a few beers after school, no big deal. But soon he was drinking every day." The waitress returned with the coffees, momentarily interrupting the conversation. Andre took the opportunity to observe Rodrigo more closely. Despite the police uniform that conveyed authority, there was a fragility in his eyes, a deep sadness that seemed to increase with every word he spoke. "Alcoholism consumed him," Rodrigo continued after taking a sip of coffee. "We tried to help him, our whole family. Hospitalizations, therapies, support groups. Nothing seemed to work for long, and then one day he just disappeared. He only took some clothes and this watch, a present from our grandfather." Andre felt his heart squeeze with every word. The story of Carlos, a man he had never met, somehow seemed to echo inside him, as if it were part of his own story. "And you?" Rodrigo asked, looking directly at Andre. "How did this watch get to you?" Andre took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the memories he was about to share. I was adopted as a baby," he began, his voice low but firm. "My adoptive parents told me that I was found on a bench in the square, with just a few clothes and this watch." Rodrigo's eyes widened at the revelation. "A park bench? When was that?" 28 years ago, Andre replied, the realization of what that might mean beginning to form in his mind. Exactly 28 years ago. A heavy silence fell over the table. The noise of the coffee, the clink of cups, the low murmur of conversations around them seemed distant, as if Andre and Rodrigo were isolated in their own bubble of revelations and possibilities. 28 years, Rodrigo muttered, more to himself than to Andre. That's exactly how long it's been since Carlos disappeared. The implication hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Andre felt his throat tighten, a mixture of emotions, hope, fear, confusion, threatening to overflow. "Do you think," Andre began, barely able to form the words, "do you think Carlos could be your father?" Rodrigo added, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's possible. More than possible, actually. It's probable." Andre felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. All his life, he had wondered about his origins, wondered who his biological parents were, why they had abandoned him. And now, sitting in a cafe in the middle of the night, he was possibly face to face with the answers he had always sought. "But why?" Andre asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Why would he leave me on a bench in the square?" Rodrigo shook his head sadly. Carlos was fighting his own demons. Alcoholism. It destroys more than just the person who drinks. It destroys families, relationships, entire lives. Maybe he thought he was protecting you. Andre felt a tear escape and roll down his cheek. He wiped it away quickly, ashamed of showing so much emotion in front of a stranger. But Rodrigo wasn't really a stranger anymore, was he? If his suspicions were correct, this man was his uncle. "We need to find him," Andre said suddenly, a fierce determination replacing the confusion in his eyes. "We need to find Carlos. He's the key to all this." Rodrigo nodded slowly. "Yes, we do, but Andre, I need you to understand something. If Carlos really is your father, and if he really gave you up for adoption, well, the reasons can be complicated. Addiction makes people make decisions that don't always make sense to others." Andre absorbed Rodrigo's words, feeling their weight. He had always imagined the moment when he would meet his biological parents as something triumphant, full of hugs and tears of joy. But the reality that was unfolding was much more complex, full of nuances and possible heartbreak. "I understand," Andre finally said, "but I need to know. I need to understand." Rodrigo looked at the young man in front of him, seeing in him the same determination he used to see in his twin brother. "All right," he agreed. "We'll find him together." At that moment, sitting in that cafe at midnight, Andre and Rodrigo sealed a silent pact. Together, they would unravel the mystery that united them, no matter where that search took them. If you're enjoying this story, please don't forget to leave a comment in the comments about where you're watching this video from and subscribe to the channel as it continues. The next few days were a whirlwind for Andre. He took a leave of absence from work, vaguely explaining that he had urgent family matters to deal with. His boss, an understanding man who had always admired Andre's dedication, didn't ask too many questions. Meanwhile, Rodrigo used all the resources at his disposal as a police officer to try to trace Carlos's whereabouts. They started with the most obvious records: hospitals, rehabilitation clinics, even prisons. But Carlos seemed to have disappeared without a trace. A week after their initial meeting, Andre and Rodrigo met again in the same cafe. The place, with its comforting aroma of coffee and old books, had become a kind of headquarters for their search. "Nothing yet," Rodrigo said, frustration evident in his voice. "It's as if he's simply evaporated." Andre nodded, feeling the weight of discouragement. Maybe we should try a different approach," he suggested. "What if, instead of looking for Carlos directly, we looked for clues about what happened that night, the night I was left?" Rodrigo raised his eyebrows, puzzled. "Like what?" "Well," Andre began, his mind working quickly, "we know the location, the bench in the square. We could investigate the area, talk to people who have lived or worked there for a long time. Someone might have seen something." A glimmer of hope lit up Rodrigo's eyes. That's brilliant, Andre. I don't know why I didn't think of it before. The square is in the Liberdade neighborhood, right?" Andre nodded. "Yes, near the Oriental Garden. My adoptive parents told me that's where they found me." "Great," Rodrigo said, getting up. "We'll start there tomorrow morning. The sooner, the better." The next morning, Andre and Rodrigo met in the square. The Oriental Garden was as beautiful as ever, with its carefully pruned trees and small lake reflecting the blue sky. People were doing Tai Chi in one corner, while children were running and laughing in another. "It's strange to think that I started my life here," Andre murmured, looking at the wooden bench where he was supposedly found. Rodrigo put a comforting hand on Andre's shoulder. "We'll find out what happened, I promise." They began their investigation methodically, approaching local shopkeepers, doormen of old buildings, and long-time residents. Most people shook their heads in disbelief, unable to remember such a specific event occurring almost 3 decades ago. However, in the late afternoon, when Andre and Rodrigo had almost given up hope, they found a promising lead. An elderly woman, who owned a small flower shop on the corner of the square, listened attentively as she watered her orchids. Her eyes, framed by deep wrinkles, shone with recognition when Andre mentioned the date. "Oh yes," she said, her voice shaky with age but full of certainty. "I remember that night. It's not every day that you see a man leaving a baby on a bench in a square." Andre and Rodrigo exchanged looks of surprise and hope. "Did you see it?" Andre asked, barely able to contain his emotion. "Can you tell us what happened?" The lady, who introduced herself as Donna Yuki, nodded slowly. "I was closing the store. It was late at night. I saw a man staggering across the square. At first I thought he was just another drunk, but then I noticed he was carrying a package. A baby." Andre felt his heart race. It was the first time he had heard a first-hand account of the night he was abandoned. "The man seemed to be struggling with himself," Mrs. Yuki continued. "He was pacing back and forth, mumbling something I couldn't understand. Then finally he put the baby on the bench. He stood there for a long time, just looking. He looked devastated." "And then what?" Rodrigo asked gently, noticing that Andre seemed unable to speak. "He took something off his wrist, a watch, I think, and put it next to the baby. Then he ran off as if he was running away from his own heart." Mrs. Yuki paused, her eyes distant with the memory. "I wanted to do something, but, well, I was afraid. When I finally plucked up the courage to approach, I saw a young couple discovering their baby. They looked so happy. I thought maybe it was fate." Andre swallowed, fighting back tears. That couple were my adoptive parents. Mrs. Yuki smiled gently, reaching out to touch Andrei's face. So fate really did act that night. You've grown up well, young man. After thanking Mrs. Yuki profusely, Andrei and Rodrigo left the flower shop, their minds spinning with the new information. That confirms it, doesn't it? Andrei said as they walked. Carlos really is my father. Rodrigo nodded gravely. It would seem so. But Andrei, remember what we talked about, the circumstances. I know, Andrei interrupted him. I know it won't be easy. But now, more than ever, I need to find him. I need to understand why he did what he did. In the days that followed, Andrei and Rodrigo intensified their search. With confirmation that Carlos had been in the city 28 years ago, they began to trace a possible path he could have followed. They visited homeless shelters, rehabilitation clinics, and even old bars in the area. In each place they left a photo of Carlos, one that Rodrigo kept in his wallet, showing the twins smiling in happier times. It was in one of these rehabilitation clinics located on the outskirts of the city that they finally had a breakthrough. An elderly nurse, on seeing the photo, exclaimed with recognition. "That man was here," she said, pointing to Carlos in the photo. "About 15 years ago, maybe. He stayed with us for almost a year." Andrei felt his heart leap. And then what? Where did he go? The nurse frowned, trying to remember. He mentioned something about starting over. He talked about a small town, Aguas de San Pedro, I think. He said he wanted to get away from the temptations of the big city. With this new information, Andrei and Rodrigo left for Aguas de San Pedro the next day. The small spa town, known for its medicinal waters and clean air, seemed an unlikely place to find someone who had been lost for so long. They began their search methodically, showing Carlos's photo in hotels, restaurants, and stores. It was on the third day, when they had almost given up hope, that they got lucky. The owner of a small grocery store looked at the photo and smiled. "Ah, yes. This is Carlos. He comes here every week to buy his fruit and vegetables." Andrei felt as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. After so many years, so many searches, he was moments away from meeting his biological father. Where can we find him?" Rodrigo asked, his voice trembling slightly. The grocer pointed in one direction. "He lives in a little house at the end of that street. You can't go wrong. It's the only one with a garden full of sunflowers." Thanking him quickly, Andrei and Rodrigo headed for the address indicated. As they got closer, Andrei felt his heart beating harder and harder. What would he say? How would he react? Years of unanswered questions, imaginings, and suppositions were about to meet reality. Finally, they arrived. The house was exactly as the grocer had described. Small, modest, with a front garden full of tall, vibrant sunflowers. Andrei stopped at the entrance to the garden, suddenly paralyzed with fear and anticipation. Rodrigo put a hand on his shoulder. "Are you ready?" Andrei took a deep breath, looking at the watch on his wrist. The watch that had brought him there. "Yes," he finally said. "I'm ready." They walked along the small path between the sunflowers and stopped in front of the door. Andrei, mustering all his courage, raised his hand and knocked. The next few seconds seemed like an eternity. Then slowly the door opened. Before them stood a middle-aged man with grey hair and tired but kind eyes. He looked first at Rodrigo, and his eyes widened in recognition. Then his gaze turned to Andrei, and at that moment, it was as if time stood still. Carlos, for it was him without a shadow of a doubt, stood paralyzed, his hand still on the door handle. His eyes, so similar to Andrei's, filled with tears. "Rodrigo?" he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. Then, looking at Andrei, he added in an almost inaudible tone, "Son." Andrei felt the tears run down his face. All the words he had rehearsed, all the questions he wanted to ask, disappeared. Instead, he simply held out his arm, showing his watch. Carlos let out a muffled sob at the sight of the watch. Slowly, as if fearing that everything would disappear if he moved too quickly, he reached out and touched Andrei's face. You found me," Carlos said, his voice breaking. At that moment, emotions overflowed. Andrei threw himself into his biological father's arms, sobbing openly. Carlos hugged him tightly, as if trying to make up for 28 years of absence in a single gesture. Rodrigo, with tears in his eyes, joined in the embrace, finally reunited with his lost twin brother. For several minutes the three men remained like that, hugging on the doorstep, letting years of pain, regret and longing flow freely. Finally Carlos pulled away slightly, looking into Andre's eyes. I have so much to explain," he said, his voice trembling. "So many mistakes to try and fix." Andre nodded, wiping away his tears. "I know, and I'm ready to listen. I'm ready to understand." Carlos invited them inside. Inside, the house was simple but welcoming. Pictures on the walls showed moments of a life rebuilt. Carlos in front of a sobriety marker, him working in a garden, smiling with friends. They sat in the small living room, the air heavy with decades of secrets about to be revealed. "Where do I start?" Carlos murmured, more to himself than to the others. "At the beginning," Andre suggested gently. "Why did you leave me in that square?" Carlos closed his eyes, the pain evident in every line of his face. "I was at rock bottom," he began. "Alcoholism had destroyed everything in my life. My work, my relationships, my dignity. When your mother became pregnant, I promised myself that I would change, that I would be the father you deserved." He paused, struggling to continue. Rodrigo reached out, taking his brother's hand in a gesture of support. "But I failed," Carlos continued. "The day you were born, I was drunk. I missed the birth of my own son because I was in a bar. Your mother, she couldn't take it. She left me a week later, saying she couldn't trust me to look after a baby." Andre listened intently, his heart clenching at the pain evident in his father's words. "I tried," Carlos said, his voice breaking. "I swear I tried to look after you on my own. But every day was a struggle. I was afraid of hurting you, of failing you like I had failed everyone else. And then one night, I made the hardest and most cowardly decision of my life." "The night in the square," Andre murmured. Carlos nodded, tears streaming freely down his face. I thought you'd have a better chance without me. That some good family would find you and give you the love and stability that I couldn't offer. I left the watch with you because I wanted you to have something to remember me by, even if you never knew who I was." The silence that followed was heavy with conflicting emotions. Andre felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and surprisingly, understanding. "What happened then?" Rodrigo asked softly. Carlos sighed deeply. "I lost myself completely. I spent years on the streets drinking to forget what I had done. But the guilt never went away. Finally, about 20 years ago, I hit rock bottom. I almost died of an alcohol overdose. That's when I decided I needed to change, not just for myself, but for the memory of the son I had abandoned." He gestured to the photos on the wall. "It wasn't easy, but I managed to recover. I've built a life here, away from the temptations of the big city. I work as a gardener now, taking care of plants. I guess it's my way of trying to make up for not taking care of you." Andre looked at his biological father's hands, hands calloused by work but gentle, hands that, in another life, could have cradled him, protected him. "I understand why you did what you did," Andre finally said, his voice low but firm. "I can't say that I forgive you completely, not yet, but I do understand. And I'm glad I found you." Carlos sobbed, relieved and emotional. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, son. But I promise if you give me the chance, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for lost years." Rodrigo, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "Brother, I've missed you all these years. I'm so glad you found your way." The three men hugged again, their tears mingling. It was a moment of healing, of new beginnings, of possibilities. In the weeks and months that followed, Andre, Carlos and Rodrigo worked hard to rebuild their relationships. It wasn't easy. There was a lot of pain to process, many lost years to regret. But there was also love, forgiveness, and the chance of a new beginning. Andre introduced his adoptive parents to Carlos, an emotional and surprisingly harmonious meeting. His adoptive parents, always loving and understanding, embraced Carlos as part of Andre's extended family. Carlos, determined to maintain his sobriety and be the father he should always have been, moved to São Paulo to be closer to Andre and Rodrigo. He continued his work as a gardener, finding peace and purpose in making things grow and flourish. Rodrigo, for his part, found a new dimension in his work as a police officer. Inspired by his brother's journey, he began to specialize in cases involving drug addiction, using his personal experience to help others find their way to recovery. And Andre? He found that the emptiness he had always felt in his heart was beginning to fill, not just with the love of his biological father and his newfound uncle, but with a deeper understanding of himself and his origins. The watch that for so long had been a reminder of his unknown past became a symbol of his journey, of loss and reunion, of second chances and new beginnings. Andre wore it every day, no longer as a connection to a nebulous past, but as a reminder of the power of forgiveness and the resilience of the human spirit. One sunny afternoon, almost a year after their reunion, Andre, Carlos and Rodrigo met again in the Oriental Garden, on the same bench where it had all begun. Sitting down, sitting side by side, the three men watched people passing by, children playing, life taking its natural course. "It's amazing how things change," Andre commented, his eyes fixed on a young mother pushing a baby carriage. "A year ago I didn't even know who I really was. Now," Carlos put a hand on his son's shoulder, "now you know you're loved, that you always have been." Rodrigo nodded, a soft smile on his lips. "Family isn't just about blood, Andre. It's choice, it's love, and the three of us have chosen to be a family." Andre smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. He looked at the watch on his wrist, the steady ticking echoing the beat of his heart. "You know," he said, "for a long time, I thought this watch was just a reminder of what I had lost. Now I see that it was an omen of what I would find." Carlos swallowed, overcome with emotion. "When I left that watch with you, it was the hardest moment of my life. But now I see that it was also the most important. It was my silent promise that one day we would meet again. And here we are," Rodrigo added, hugging them both. At that moment, sitting on the bench that had witnessed so much drama and emotion, the three men felt that they had finally arrived home. The circle was complete. But this wasn't a conclusion. It was a new beginning. Andre knew that there was still much to be explored, much to be healed. The journey of forgiveness and reconciliation was far from over. There would be difficult days ahead, moments of doubt and perhaps even anger. The ghost of Carlos's alcoholism still hung over them, a constant reminder of the fragility of recovery. However, there was also hope. Hope in the little things, in the Sunday lunches that had become a tradition, in the long late-night conversations where they shared stories of their separate lives, in the silent moments of mutual understanding. Carlos was determined to be the father Andre deserved, even if it was too late. He attended all the Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, worked hard in his therapy, and strove every day to earn his son's forgiveness and love. Rodrigo, for his part, found a new purpose. Using his personal and professional experience, he began giving talks in schools about the dangers of alcoholism and the importance of family support. His story of loss and reunion touched hearts and opened minds. And Andre, he discovered an inner strength he didn't know he possessed. The journey to find his origins had transformed him. He became more compassionate, more understanding of the struggles of others. He began volunteering at a support center for adopted children, sharing his story and offering hope. The watch on Andre's wrist continued to tick, but now every tick was a celebration of time regained, of opportunities for healing, of love that persists even in the most unlikely circumstances. One evening, as they ate dinner together, something that had become a cherished habit, Andre looked around the table. He saw his biological father, Carlos, laughing at a joke made by Rodrigo. He saw his adoptive parents who had been invited and embraced this extended family with unconditional love. He saw Rodrigo, the uncle who had become one of his greatest supporters. At that moment, Andre understood a profound truth. Family is not defined by blood or the circumstances of birth. Family is built through love, understanding, and forgiveness. It is forged in the struggles shared and the joys celebrated together. The clock on his wrist continued to tick, but Andre was no longer looking to the past. He was firmly anchored in the present, with his eyes set on the future. A future full of possibilities, love, and second chances. As the evening progressed and conversations flowed around the table, André felt a peace he had never experienced before. He was home, not just in a physical place, but in a place of the heart, a place where past, present, and future were woven together in a rich and complex tapestry of love and forgiveness. The clock kept ticking, but now it was more than a link to the past. It was a promise for the future, a future that André, Carlos, and Rodrigo would build together, day by day, moment by moment. And so our story comes to an end. But for André, Carlos, and Rodrigo, it was only the beginning of a new life, a new family, a new understanding of what it means to love and forgive. The clock on André's wrist would continue to tick, but now every second was precious. Every minute was an opportunity. Every hour was a gift, because in the end it's not the time we waste that defines our lives. It's what we do with the time we're given, and André, Carlos, and Rodrigo were determined to make every moment count. And so, as the sun set over São Paulo, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, 3 men, a son, a father, and an uncle, walked together through Jardim Oriental. Their steps were in sync, their hearts beating to the same rhythm. The watch on André's wrist glowed in the twilight, a constant reminder that sometimes you have to lose something to truly appreciate it, and that with love, forgiveness, and courage, even lost time can be regained. End of story.